A black teenager stood before the judge for stealing a car. But when he revealed why he did it, even the prosecutor couldn't hold back tears. The coughing from the next room made Andre's hand shake as he counted the pills again. 7 different medications, 3 times a day. The orange bottles lined up on the kitchen counter like soldiers, their white caps a stark contrast against the peeling linoleum. Each one cost more than the last month's electricity bill. Andre? His mother's voice was weak, barely carrying through the thin wall of their Detroit apartment. Baby, is that you? Yeah, Mom. I'm getting your morning dose ready. Andre's fingers fumbled with the child-proof cap of the pain medication. The irony wasn't lost on him. At 16, he was responsible enough to manage his mother's cancer treatment schedule, but not trusted to open a bottle without supervision. The sound of sirens filtered through the cracked window, a familiar backdrop to their morning routine. Andre filled a glass with tap water, watching the liquid tremble slightly as his upstairs neighbor's heavy footsteps shook the ceiling. He carried the pills and water to his mother's bedroom, pushing open the door with his shoulder. The sight of her made his chest tight. She seemed smaller than yesterday, lost in the tangle of thin blankets. Her dark skin had taken on an ashen tone, and her eyes, though bright with fever, were sunken into her face. Morning, baby, she managed between coughs. Did you get any sleep? Some. Andre helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her back. The lie came easily after 3 years of practice. Sleep had become a distant memory since his father's accident at the construction site. The legal battle that followed had drained their savings and left them with nothing but bitter memories of corporate lawyers and settlement offers that wouldn't cover a month's rent. His mother's hands shook as she took the pills one by one. You're going to be late for school? I've got time. Andre watched her struggle with each swallow. The first period is just study hall anyway. Andre James Wilson. Her tone strengthened momentarily, a flash of her old self breaking through. Education is your ticket out of here. You know what your father always said. Knowledge is the one thing they can't repossess, Andre finished. I know, Mom. I'm keeping my grades up. She nodded, satisfaction briefly overshadowing the pain in her expression. Good boy. Now go on, get to school. I'll be fine until you get back. Andre gathered his worn backpack from beside the door, checking one last time that his mother had everything within reach. Water, phone, emergency button. The routine was automatic now, like breathing. The walk to Detroit Central High School took 20 minutes through streets that never quite woke up. Abandoned storefronts watched him pass, their boarded windows like closed eyes. Andre kept his head down, hands in his pockets, moving with a purposeful stride that made most people look past him. Mr. Wilson, Ms. Thompson, his first period teacher, caught him trying to slip into class unnoticed. Nice of you to join us. Again, Andre slid into his usual seat at the back. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, making the headache behind his eyes pulse stronger. Around him, other students tapped on phones or whispered conversations about weekend plans. Normal teenage life that seemed to happen in a parallel universe to his own. The morning dragged by in a blur of lectures and assignments he couldn't focus on. During lunch, Andre sat alone, using the time to check his mother's medication schedule on his cracked phone screen. The numbers at the bottom of the pharmacy app made his stomach clench. Next month's refills would cost more than they had. After school, the medical center waiting room was already half full when Andre arrived with his mother. She leaned heavily on his arm as they made their way to the hard plastic chairs. The overhead TV droned on about insurance policies and payment plans. Dr. Martinez's office felt colder than usual. Andre sat rigid in the chair beside his mother as the doctor reviewed her latest test results. The cancer is progressing faster than we'd hoped, Dr. Martinez said, his fingers steepled on the desk. Without the new treatment protocol we discussed, I'm afraid. The words blurred together in Andre's head. Numbers and percentages and time frames that all added up to one thing. They needed money they didn't have. His mother's hand found his, squeezing with what little strength she had left. That night, Andre lay on his thin mattress, listening to the muffled sounds of his mother, trying not to cry in the next room. The pain medication was wearing off early again. They'd have to stretch the prescription another week until the refill date. Through his window, The street lights cast yellow shadows on the ceiling. A car alarm went off somewhere in the distance, then fell silent. Andre turned onto his side, his mind racing through options they'd already exhausted. No more relatives to borrow from. No more payment plans to negotiate. No more extensions or deferrals, or understanding nods from doctors who still sent bills anyway. The sound of his mother's coughing grew worse, then stopped abruptly. Andre held his breath, counting the seconds until it started again. In the silence, he could hear her trying to muffle her sobs with a pillow. Andre pressed his palms against his eyes until he saw spots. The pressure in his chest built until he could barely breathe. Something had to give. Something had to change. Outside his window, a car engine started, then idled. Andre got up and looked down at the street. An old Honda sat running, steam rising from its exhaust in the cool night air. The driver's door was open, no one in sight. Andre's heart beat faster as he watched. The car kept idling, waiting. His mother's cough echoed through the wall again, followed by a whimper of pain that made his decision for him. Andre pulled on his hoodie, his movements mechanical, disconnected from conscious thought. His hand was steady as he opened his bedroom door. The hallway stretched before him like a point of no return. Behind him, his mother coughed again, the sound wet and raw. Ahead, through the window, the car's engine hummed its invitation. Andre took the first step forward, and everything that came after felt like falling. Andre's sneakers made no sound on the apartment stairs. Each step down felt like moving through water, his limbs heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. The building's front door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet street. The Honda was still there, engine running, driver's door open like an invitation. Street lights reflected off its worn blue paint, creating shadows that seemed to shift and move as Andre approached. His breath came in short bursts, visible in the cold night air. "Just need money for the meds," he whispered to himself, the words forming small clouds in front of his face. "Just need enough for one treatment." The car's interior light was on, illuminating a messy front seat with scattered papers and empty coffee cups. Keys dangled from the ignition, swaying slightly with the engine's vibration. Andre stood frozen beside the open door, his hand hovering over the keys. From somewhere up above, his mother's cough echoed into the night. The sound broke through his hesitation like a gunshot. Andre slid into the driver's seat, his movements jerky and uncertain. The leather was still warm from its previous driver. He gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, just like his father had taught him during practice runs in empty parking lots years ago. "Okay," he breathed, shifting into drive. "Okay." The car moved forward smoothly, too easily. Andre kept his speed exactly at the limit, hands clenched so tight on the wheel that his knuckles showed white against his dark skin. Every passing car made his heart jump, every traffic light an eternity of exposure. He headed toward the industrial district, where Marcus hung out. Marcus dealt in stolen cars. Everyone knew that, though nobody talked about it openly. Andre had overheard him once, bragging about quick cash for clean vehicles. The information had stuck in his mind like a splinter, waiting for desperate times. Detroit's abandoned warehouses loomed ahead, their broken windows dark and accusing. Andre pulled into an alley behind what used to be an auto parts store, killing the headlights, but leaving the engine running. His phone showed 3 missed calls from home. Marcus answered on the first ring. "Who this?" "It's Andre. Wilson's kid. I got something to sell." A long pause followed. "Man, it's late. And you're what, 15? 16, Andre corrected automatically. "I got a clean Honda. Running perfect. No questions asked." Another pause. "Where you at?" Andre gave the location, his voice shaking slightly. The call ended without another word. While he waited, Andre's mind raced through calculations. A decent used car might bring $5,000, maybe more if Marcus was feeling generous. The new treatment cost $12,000 per session. His mother needed at least 3 sessions to have a chance. The numbers wouldn't add up no matter how he twisted them. Headlights swept across his rearview mirror. Andre's pulse spiked as a black SUV pulled up behind him, blocking the alley's exit. 2 figures got out, moving with the casual confidence of predators. Marcus's gold tooth caught the dim light as he approached the driver's window. "Step out, kid." Andre's legs felt weak as he complied. The second man circled the Honda, examining it with a professional eye. "Keys," Marcus demanded, holding out his hand. Andre passed them over, watching as Marcus leaned into the car to check the ignition. The radio was still playing softly, some late-night DJ talking about love songs and lonely hearts. "Where'd you get it?" Marcus straightened up, his expression unreadable. "Found it running." Andre's voice sounded young and scared in his own ears. "Driver left it. You just thought you'd bring it to me?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Man, I don't deal with kids. Too much heat. Too much risk. Get out of here before I forget I know your daddy." "Please." Andre stepped forward, desperation making him bold. "I need the money. My mom's dying. I said get out of here." Marcus's voice hardened. "Don't make me tell you twice." Red and blue lights suddenly painted the alley walls. Andre's heart stopped as a police cruiser appeared at the entrance, its spotlight cutting through the darkness like a knife. Marcus and his partner vanished into the shadows with practiced ease, leaving Andre alone beside the stolen Honda. His legs wouldn't move. His mind went blank except for one thought. His mother would die alone. "Hands where we can see them." The command boomed through the patrol car speaker. "Step away from the vehicle." Andre raised his hands slowly, tears burning in his eyes. Two officers approached from different angles, their guns drawn and steady. "On your knees." Andre's legs folded. The asphalt was cold and wet through his jeans. Metal cuffs bit into his wrists as an officer roughly pulled his arms behind his back. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer began reciting. Andre barely heard the words over the roaring in his ears. They patted him down, found his school ID, radioed in his information. "Jesus, he's just a kid," one officer muttered to his partner. The ride to the juvenile detention center was silent except for the radio dispatcher's crackling voice. Andre watched his neighborhood pass by through the window, everything familiar made strange by tears and fear. Processing felt like a bad dream. Fingerprints. Photos. Questions he answered in a monotone. They took his hoodie, his shoes, his phone with its 3 missed calls still showing on the screen. "One phone call," the intake officer said, pointing to a wall-mounted phone. Andre dialed home with trembling fingers. Each ring felt like a year passing. "Hello." His mother's voice was thick with sleep and medication. "Andre." "Mom." The word came out as a sob. "Mom, I messed up." The silence that followed was worse than any screaming could have been. "Where are you?" she finally asked, her voice terrifyingly calm. "Juvenile detention." Andre pressed his forehead against the cold wall. "I did something stupid. I'm so sorry. Oh, baby." Now she was crying too, the sound making his chest hurt worse than any physical pain. "What did you do?" Andre couldn't answer. Down the hall, a door slammed. Someone was shouting in another room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects. "I'll fix it," he promised, though he had no idea how. "I'll make it right." "Time's up," the officer called. "Mom, I have to go. I love you." "I'm sorry." Andre hung up before she could respond, the words burning in his throat like acid. They led him to a holding cell, bare except for a narrow bed and a stainless steel toilet. The door closed with a final-sounding click. Andre sat on the thin mattress, his back against the cold wall. Through the small window in the door, he could see other cells, other kids who had made bad choices or had bad choices made for them. Somewhere in the building, a clock ticked away the hours until morning. Andre stayed awake, watching shadows move across the cell floor, thinking about his mother alone in their apartment, probably still awake too. The magnitude of what he'd done settled over him like a heavy blanket. He tried to steal a car. He'd been arrested. He had a record now, and his mother was still sick, still dying, still needed help he couldn't provide. Dawn began to light the small window near the ceiling. Another day was starting in Detroit. In a few hours, his mother would need her morning medications. But this time, Andre wouldn't be there to count them out, wouldn't be there to help her sit up, wouldn't be there to lie about getting enough sleep. He pressed his palms against his eyes until he saw spots, just like he had done in his bedroom, what felt like a lifetime ago. But this time, there was no car idling outside his window. No desperate solution waiting to be taken. Just consequences, ticking closer with each passing second. The fluorescent lights buzzed to life in Andre's cell at exactly 6 a.m. He hadn't slept, his eyes burning as he blinked against the sudden brightness. The thin mattress had left his back stiff, and his mouth felt like sandpaper. "Wilson!" A guard's voice echoed down the corridor. "You've got visitors?" Andre's heart jumped into his throat. His mother couldn't have come. She could barely make it to the bathroom on her own most days. But when he was led to the visitation room, he saw her sitting there, looking smaller than ever in her wheelchair. A nurse from the hospital stood behind her, checking her oxygen levels. 10 minutes, the guard said, stepping back to give them some privacy. Andre couldn't meet his mother's eyes. The silence stretched between them like a physical barrier. "The hospital called me this morning," his mother finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Said my blood pressure was too high. Wanted to admit me for observation." She paused for a breath, the oxygen machine hissing softly. "Had to tell them my son was in juvenile detention." Each word hit Andre like a physical blow. "Mom, I don't." She held up one trembling hand. "Just don't, Andre. What were you thinking? Stealing a car?" "I was thinking about the $12,000 for your treatment." The words burst out before he could stop them. "About how the insurance won't cover it. About how you're getting worse every day, and I can't do anything to help." His mother's face crumpled. The nurse stepped forward, concerned, but she waved him away. "Baby, that's not your burden to carry." Her voice broke. "You're 16. You're supposed to be worried about school and girls and basketball. Not this." Andre's vision blurred with tears. "Who else is going to carry it? Dad's gone. We've got no family left. The system doesn't care if you live or die." The outburst left him shaking. His mother reached for his hand across the table, but the guard stepped forward, shaking his head at the contact. "Mrs. Wilson?" The nurse touched her shoulder gently. "Your vitals are spiking. We need to get you back to the hospital." Andre watched helplessly as his mother's face contorted with pain. The nurse began wheeling her toward the door. "Mom!" Andre stood up, but the guard's hand on his shoulder kept him in place. "Mom, I'm sorry." She turned back, her eyes filled with tears. "I love you, baby. We'll figure this out." The door closed behind them, leaving Andre alone with the guard and the humming fluorescent lights. Back in his cell, time moved like molasses. A public defender visited briefly, explaining the charges and possible consequences in a tired voice that suggested he'd given this speech 100 times before. "Grand theft auto," the lawyer said, shuffling through his papers. "First offense, juvenile status. We might be able to work something out, but it depends on the judge we get." Andre barely heard him. All he could think about was his mother in the hospital, hooked up to machines, probably blaming herself for his choices. The social worker came next. Ms. Carter was young, with kind eyes and a notebook full of questions. "Tell me about your home life, Andre," she said, pen poised over paper. So he told her. About his father's death at the construction site. About the company's lawyers who buried them in paperwork until they couldn't afford to fight anymore. About watching his mother get sicker and sicker while insurance companies denied claims and doctors talked about experimental treatments that cost more than their apartment building was worth. "And you thought stealing a car would solve this?" Miss Carter's tone wasn't accusatory, just curious. Andre stared at his hands. "I thought I could sell it. Get enough for at least one treatment." He laughed bitterly. "Couldn't even do that right. Guy took one look at me and said I was too young to deal with." Miss Carter made notes in her file. "Your school records show you're maintaining AB average despite all this. That's impressive. Mom says education is the one thing they can't take away." The words tasted like ash in his mouth now. "The hearing is tomorrow morning," Miss Carter said, closing her notebook. "The judge will want to hear from you directly. Think carefully about what you want to say." That night, alone in his cell, Andre did think about it. He thought about his mother's face in the visitation room, about the pain and disappointment in her eyes. He thought about his father, who had always taught him to face consequences head-on. He thought about the car's owner, probably just some person trying to get through their own day, who didn't deserve to have their life disrupted by his desperation. The public defender had suggested claiming peer pressure, blaming bad influences. It might get him a lighter sentence, but lying about it felt like another betrayal, another wrong choice piled on top of the first one. Morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. They gave him clean clothes for court, khakis and a button-down shirt that didn't quite fit. His reflection in the bathroom mirror looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed, shoulders hunched under the weight of adult decisions. The courthouse loomed ahead as the transport van pulled up. Andre's legs felt weak as they led him inside, past metal detectors and security guards, through corridors that smelled of floor wax and anxiety. The courtroom doors looked like they weighed 1,000 pounds each. Andre could hear voices inside, the shuffle of papers, the murmur of conversations about lives being decided. Somewhere in there, a judge was waiting to hear his story. His mother would be there too, he realized, watching him face the consequences of trying to help her in exactly the wrong way. "Ready?" the guard asked, reaching for the door handle. Andre straightened his shoulders, trying to find strength he wasn't sure he had. The door opened, and the murmuring voices fell silent. He took the first step forward, just like he had that night in his apartment hallway. But this time he wasn't falling. This time, he was walking toward the truth, whatever it cost him. The courtroom smelled like old wood and fear. Andre's footsteps echoed on the polished floor as the guard led him to the defendant's table. The room wasn't large, but every inch of space felt charged with tension. His mother sat in her wheelchair in the first row, an oxygen tank beside her. The hospital nurse stood nearby, monitoring her vitals. She looked worse than yesterday, the fluorescent lights harsh against her ashen skin. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the room. The Honorable Judge Michael Harrison presiding. Andre stood on shaky legs as the judge entered. Harrison was older, with steel-gray hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. He moved with the confidence of someone who held other people's futures in his hands every day. "Be seated," Judge Harrison said, adjusting his robes as he settled into his chair. Case number 2025, JD 1435, State of Michigan versus Andre James Wilson. He looked up, fixing Andre with a penetrating stare. Juvenile defendant is present with counsel. How do you plead to the charge of grand theft auto? Andre's public defender, Mr. Martinez, stood. "Your Honor, my client pleads." "Let the defendant speak for himself," Judge Harrison interrupted. "Mr. Wilson?" Andre swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Guilty, Your Honor." A small sound came from where his mother sat. Andre didn't dare look back. The prosecutor stood, straightening her blazer. "Your Honor, the state views this as a serious offense. While the defendant is a juvenile with no prior record, the premeditated nature of the crime." "Objection, Your Honor," Mr. Martinez cut in. "The state is editorializing. There's no evidence of premeditation." Sustained. Judge Harrison turned to the prosecutor. "Ms. Reynolds, present your case without commentary." Ms. Reynolds nodded. "The facts are straightforward, Your Honor. On the night of February 1st, 2025, the defendant stole a 2020 Honda Civic from outside the Victory Apartments on Detroit's east side. The vehicle was running at the time, left briefly unattended by its owner. Police responded to a suspicious vehicle report and found the defendant attempting to sell the stolen car to a known fence. She walked closer to the judge's bench. The state has the arresting officers present to testify, as well as the vehicle's owner. We're asking for the maximum allowable sentence under juvenile statutes, given the serious nature of the offense. Andre's hands clenched under the table. Maximum sentence meant juvenile detention until he was 18. His mother would be alone. "Your Honor," Mr. Martinez stood again. "The defense would like to present mitigating circumstances that led to my client's actions." Judge Harrison studied Andre over his glasses. "I'm more interested in hearing directly from Mr. Wilson. Young man, would you like to explain yourself to this court?" Andre felt every eye in the room focus on him. His public defender had prepared a statement, carefully worded to emphasize his clean record and academic achievements. But the rehearsed words felt like lies in his mouth. "Permission to approach the stand, Your Honor?" Andre's voice cracked slightly. The judge nodded. "Bailiff, swear in the defendant." Andre's legs felt like lead as he walked to the witness stand. The bailiff held out a Bible. Place your left hand on the Bible. Raise your right hand. The bailiff's voice was impersonal. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God? I do. The words felt heavy with meaning. Judge Harrison leaned forward. Mr. Wilson, this is your opportunity to help me understand why a 16-year-old student with no criminal record decided to steal a car. Andre glanced at his mother. She sat perfectly still, the oxygen mask fogging slightly with each breath. The nurse was checking her blood pressure again, frowning at the numbers. Your Honor, Andre started, then stopped. Started again. 3 years ago, my dad died in a construction accident. The company's insurance paid out just enough for the funeral. We sued for negligence, but he swallowed hard. We couldn't afford to keep fighting their lawyers. The judge made a note on his pad. Go on. Mom got diagnosed with cancer last year. Stage 3. The insurance. Andre's voice caught. They said the treatment she needs is experimental. Not covered. $12,000 per session. And she needs at least 3 to have a chance. Ms. Reynolds stood. Your Honor, while these circumstances are unfortunate, they don't justify. Ms. Reynolds. Judge Harrison's voice was sharp. Let him finish. Andre gripped the edge of the witness stand. I've tried everything. Applied for assistance programs, called charities. Looked for extra jobs. But Mom keeps getting worse, and the doctors say without this treatment, he couldn't finish the sentence. So, you decided to steal a car? The judge's tone was neutral. I knew a guy who deals in stolen cars. Thought maybe I could get enough for one treatment at least. Andre's shoulders slumped. He took one look at me and said I was too young. That's when the police came. The courtroom was silent except for the soft hiss of his mother's oxygen tank. Mr. Wilson, Judge Harrison removed his glasses. Do you understand that what you did was wrong? Yes, Your Honor. And if you could go back to that night, would you make the same choice? Andre looked directly at the judge. No, sir, not because I got caught, but because... He glanced at his mother again. Because I hurt more people than I helped. The car's owner didn't deserve that. And I made my mom's condition worse by stressing her out. I was trying to fix something, but I just broke more things. Judge Harrison studied him for a long moment. Ms. Reynolds, call your first witness. The prosecutor stood. The state calls Officer James Chun. The police officer who had arrested Andre took the stand. He described finding the stolen Honda, Andre's immediate surrender, his cooperation during arrest. Did the defendant resist in any way? Ms. Reynolds asked. No, ma'am, Officer Chun replied. He was polite, followed all commands. When we cuffed him, he was crying, kept saying he was sorry. The prosecutor called the car's owner next. Mr. Peterson was middle-aged, wearing a mechanic's uniform. I just ran inside to grab my wallet, he testified. Left the car running because it was cold. When I came out, it was gone. My tools were in that car. I need them for work. Andre's stomach twisted with guilt. He hadn't even thought about what might have been in the car, who he might have been hurting. The morning wore on. More witnesses. More questions. Andre's public defender did his best to highlight Andre's academic record, his lack of prior trouble, the desperate circumstances. By lunch recess, Andre felt hollowed out. The bailiff led him to a holding cell while the court broke for lunch. Through the small window in the door, he could see his mother being wheeled toward the bathroom by the nurse. Mom, he called out. She turned her head, and the look in her eyes broke something inside him. Not anger or disappointment, just sadness, deep and endless. Your blood pressure's too high, he heard the nurse saying. We should get you back to the hospital? No. His mother's voice was firm despite its weakness. I'm staying. My boy needs me here. Andre pressed his forehead against the cold metal door. He tried to save her, and instead, he was making her sicker with worry. The bailiff returned too soon. Time to go back in. The afternoon session loomed ahead like a storm on the horizon. Andre straightened his borrowed shirt, trying to find strength in the memory of his father's voice. Stand up straight when you face your troubles, son. Look them in the eye. The courtroom doors opened, and Andre walked back into the arena where his future would be decided. The judge's bench waited like an altar of judgment, and the truth he'd have to tell stretched before him like a tightrope with no net below. His mother's oxygen tank hissed softly in the gallery behind him. The sound reminded him of time running out, of chances slipping away, of consequences rolling in like waves that would either drown him or carry him somewhere new. The bailiff's voice rang out again. All rise. Andre stood, his legs steadier now. Whatever came next, he would face it standing up straight, looking it in the eye. Defense calls Andre Wilson back to the stand. Mr. Martinez announced as court resumed. Andre's shoes squeaked on the polished floor as he made his way back to the witness stand. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom. Mr. Wilson, his lawyer began, could you tell us about your typical day? Andre glanced at his mother before answering. The nurse was checking her oxygen levels again. I wake up at 5, he said, his voice stronger than before. Help Mom with her morning medications. There's 7 different kinds, specific times for each one. Get her breakfast. Make sure she's comfortable before school. And after school, straight home. Mom can't work anymore, so I handle everything. Groceries, bills, cleaning. Making sure she takes her evening meds. Helping her to bed. Andre's hands twisted in his lap. Homework if I'm not too tired. How are your grades? B average. Used to be better before. He trailed off. Mr. Martinez nodded. Tell us about the night you took the car. Walk us through your decision. Ms. Reynolds stood. Objection, Your Honor. We've already established the facts of the crime. Your Honor, Mr. Martinez countered. The defendant's state of mind is relevant to sentencing. Judge Harrison considered for a moment. Overruled. But keep it focused, Mr. Martinez. Andre took a deep breath. Mom had a bad night. The pain medication wasn't working right. I could hear her crying through the wall, trying to be quiet about it. His voice cracked. Earlier that day, the doctor said without the new treatment, she might only have months left. Maybe weeks. The courtroom was silent except for the soft hiss of the oxygen tank. I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about the treatment costs, about watching her get worse every day. Andre's hands clenched. Then I saw the car through my window. Engine running, nobody around. And I just moved. Didn't really think. Just went downstairs and got in. What was your plan? Mr. Martinez asked. Sell it fast. Get whatever money I could. Maybe enough for one treatment at least. Andre laughed bitterly. Stupid plan. Guy took one look at me and knew I was too young, too desperate. No further questions. Mr. Martinez sat down. Ms. Reynolds approached the stand, her heels clicking sharply. Mr. Wilson, you've painted a very sympathetic picture. But isn't it true that you made a conscious decision to steal someone else's property? Yes, ma'am. You knew it was wrong? Yes, ma'am. You knew there could be consequences? Andre met her eyes. Honestly, I wasn't thinking about consequences. All I could think about was Mom getting worse every day, and how much the treatment costs, and how nothing I did legally was helping. So you decided the law didn't apply to you? Ms. Reynolds pressed. Objection. Mr. Martinez stood. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Harrison said. Watch your tone, Ms. Reynolds. The prosecutors switched tactics. Mr. Wilson, did you consider how stealing the car might affect its owner? No, ma'am. Andre's voice was quiet. I should have, but I didn't. Mr. Peterson needed his tools for work, and I could have ruined his life too. I see that now. You say you did this for your mother, but hasn't your arrest made her condition worse? Andre flinched. Yes. In fact, she had to be hospitalized due to stress from your actions, correct? Yes. The word was barely audible. So, in trying to help her, you actually— Objection. Mr. Martinez's chair scraped back, badgering the witness. Sustained. Judge Harrison leaned forward. Ms. Reynolds, make your point without the dramatics. The prosecutor nodded. One last question, Mr. Wilson. If you're released, what's to stop you from trying something like this again? Given that your mother's situation hasn't changed? Andre was quiet for a long moment. The afternoon sun had moved, throwing his face into shadow. Because I saw what it did to her, he finally said. Not just the stress making her sick, but the look in her eyes when she visited me in detention. Like she blamed herself for my choices. His voice strengthened. I wanted to help her live. Instead, I'm killing her faster with worry. I won't do that again. Ms. Reynolds studied him, then nodded. No further questions. Redirect. Your Honor? Mr. Martinez stood. Judge Harrison gestured permission. Andre, what would you do differently if you could go back to that night? Talk to someone. The social worker, maybe. Or my school counselor. Andre's shoulders straightened slightly. Keep looking for legal options. There had to be other ways, programs, or something. I got scared. Felt like I was running out of time. And now I know better. Breaking the law doesn't help anyone. Just makes everything worse. Andre looked at his mother. I'm supposed to be helping carry her burdens, not adding to them. No further questions, Mr. Martinez said. Judge Harrison removed his glasses. Mr. Wilson, stay where you are. I have some questions of my own. Andre's hands gripped the edge of the witness stand. You mentioned 7 medications. Tell me about managing those. Yes, or different times, different amounts. Some with food, some without. Some can't be taken together. Andre recited the schedule from memory. The pain meds are the hardest. They're expensive, so we have to stretch them sometimes. Make them last longer than they're supposed to. And you handle this yourself? Yes, Sir, Mom's usually too sick to keep track. I have a notebook where I write everything down. The judge made a note. Your father's accident. You mentioned a lawsuit? Construction site collapse. Company's insurance paid $17,000 for funeral costs and basic compensation. Andre's voice turned bitter. Their lawyers buried us in paperwork. Said Dad signed waivers, knew the risks. We couldn't afford to keep fighting. And your mother's current treatment status? Terminal without the new procedure. Insurance won't cover it because it's experimental. $12,000 per session, minimum 3 sessions. Andre swallowed hard. We got maybe $800 saved. Mom's disability checks barely cover rent and current medications. Judge Harrison studied him for a long moment. Looking back now, what do you think you deserve as punishment for stealing that car? Andre straightened in his seat. Whatever you decide, Your Honor. I did something wrong. I know that. But he glanced at his mother again. Whatever happens, I just need to know she'll be taken care of. That's all I care about. The judge nodded slowly. One last question. What do you want to do with your life, Andre? Assuming you get through this. What's your plan? Used to want to be an engineer like my dad. Andre's voice softened. Now, maybe medical research. Find better treatments, make them more affordable. Help people who can't help themselves. He paused. But do it the right way this time. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. You may step down. Judge Harrison turned to the lawyers. Any other witnesses? Both shook their heads. Very well. Court will recess for 30 minutes while I consider my decision. The judge stood. Bailiff, please escort the defendant back to holding. As Andre walked past his mother, she reached out one trembling hand. The bailiff hesitated, then looked away as Andre quickly squeezed her fingers. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered. I know, baby, she whispered back. I know. In the holding cell, Andre paced. 5 steps one way, 5 steps back. The afternoon sun had moved again, creating bars of light on the floor through the window. His future hung in the balance. But more importantly, his mother's future waited on the judge's decision. Would he see the desperate kid who stole a car, or the overwhelmed teenager trying to save his mother's life? The minutes ticked by like hours. Andre thought about Mr. Peterson's testimony, about Officer Chin's description of his arrest, about Ms. Reynolds' sharp questions and his own fumbling answers. He thought about his father, who had always taught him to own his mistakes, about his mother, fighting for breath in her wheelchair while he added to her burdens. The bailiff's keys jingled in the lock. They're ready for you. Andre took one deep breath, then another. The walk back to the courtroom felt like walking through water again, just like that night with the car. But this time, he wasn't sneaking. This time, he held his head up. Whatever came next, he would face it like his father taught him. The courtroom doors opened. His future waited on the other side. The courtroom had grown stuffy during recess. Late afternoon sun painted the wood panels golden as Andre retook his seat beside Mr. Martinez. His mother's oxygen tank hissed rhythmically behind him, marking time like a metronome. All rise, the bailiff called as Judge Harrison returned. The judge settled into his chair, arranging papers before him. Before I make my final decision, I'd like to hear from one more witness. He looked up. Ms. Carter, please take the stand. Andre watched the social worker make her way forward. She carried her ever-present notebook, her young face serious as she was sworn in. "Ms. Carter," Judge Harrison began, "you've been assigned to evaluate Mr. Wilson's case. Please share your findings with the court." She opened her notebook. "Your Honor, in my assessment, Andre Wilson represents an unusual case. Despite severe economic and personal hardships, he's maintained academic performance and taken on adult responsibilities far beyond his years." The social worker glanced at Andre before continuing. "During our interviews, I observed a teenager struggling with impossible choices. He's essentially functioning as a primary caregiver, managing complex medical schedules and household responsibilities while trying to maintain his education. And your professional opinion regarding his criminal actions?" the judge prompted. "The theft appears to be an isolated act of desperation, not indicative of criminal tendencies or antisocial behavior." Ms. Carter's voice was firm. "Andre shows genuine remorse and understanding of his actions' impact on others. More importantly, he demonstrates the kind of resilience and determination that suggests high rehabilitation potential." Ms. Reynolds stood. "Your Honor, may I question the witness?" The judge nodded. "Ms. Carter," the prosecutor approached the stand, "isn't it possible that Mr. Wilson's apparent remorse is simply a response to being caught?" "Based on my experience and training, no." Ms. Carter met the prosecutor's gaze steadily. "His primary concern throughout our sessions has been his mother's well-being, not his own situation. When discussing the crime, he consistently focused on how his actions affected others, his mother's health, Mr. Peterson's livelihood, rather than potential consequences to himself." "But you can't guarantee he won't reoffend?" "No one can guarantee another person's future actions," Ms. Carter replied. "But I can say that Andre shows clear understanding of his mistake and its consequences. He's also demonstrated long-term commitment to responsible behavior through his academic record and family care." The prosecutor pressed on. "In your report, you mentioned that the underlying circumstances, his mother's illness and financial situation, remain unchanged. Doesn't this create a risk of repeated criminal behavior?" Ms. Carter paused, considering. "That's precisely why I'm recommending court intervention, not through punishment, but through connecting the family with appropriate support services. There are programs available that could help manage Mrs. Wilson's medical costs and provide assistance with care coordination. Programs they apparently haven't accessed so far," Ms. Reynolds pointed out. "Many families in crisis aren't aware of available resources," Ms. Carter explained. "Part of my role is helping them navigate these systems. I've already identified several options that could help the Wilsons, including medical cost assistance programs and respite care services." The prosecutor returned to her seat. Mr. Martinez declined to question the witness. Judge Harrison leaned forward. "Ms. Carter, in your experience, how unusual is Mr. Wilson's situation?" "Unfortunately, Your Honor, it's becoming more common. We're seeing increasing numbers of young people taking on caregiver roles, particularly in families affected by serious illness or disability." She gestured to her notebook. "What makes Andre's case stand out is the level of responsibility he's maintained while dealing with extreme stress. Most teenagers in similar situations show significant decline in school performance and social functioning." The judge nodded. "Thank you, Ms. Carter. You may step down." He turned to the lawyers. "Final arguments?" Ms. Reynolds stood first. "Your Honor, while the defendant's circumstances are sympathetic, the state cannot ignore the serious nature of his crime. Grand theft auto carries significant penalties because it represents a threat to public safety and property. We ask the court to impose appropriate consequences that will deter both this defendant and others from similar actions." She paused, then added more softly. "However, given the testimony we've heard, the state would not object to a rehabilitative sentence structure that includes support services for the defendant's family." Mr. Martinez rose next. "Your Honor, my client made a serious mistake. He knows this. But this mistake occurred within a context of extraordinary pressure and limited options. Andre Wilson is not a criminal. He's a young man drowning in adult responsibilities who made one desperate choice in a moment of crisis." The defender gestured toward Andre. "He's demonstrated character through years of managing his mother's care while maintaining his education. He's shown remorse and understanding of his actions' impact. Most importantly, he's shown us exactly who he is, someone who will do anything to help his family, but who now understands that breaking the law only makes things worse. The judge listened silently, making occasional notes. When both lawyers finished, he removed his glasses and studied Andre directly. "Mr. Wilson, do you have anything final to add before I make my decision?" Andre stood, his borrowed shirt crisp despite the long day. "Yes, Your Honor." He took a deep breath. "I know what I did was wrong. Not just legally wrong, but morally wrong. Mr. Peterson needed his car and tools for work. I could have hurt his family trying to help mine." His voice grew stronger. "I can't change what I did, but I can learn from it. Ms. Carter mentioned programs that might help with Mom's treatment. I want to explore those, do things the right way, and—" He hesitated, then continued, "I want to make something good come from this mistake. Maybe help other families figure out options before they get desperate enough to break the law." The judge nodded slowly. "Very well. This court will recess for 15 minutes while I finalize my decision." The bailiff called, "All rise," as Judge Harrison left the bench. In the tense quiet that followed, Andre heard his mother's breathing becoming more labored. The nurse leaned down to check her vitals. "Mrs. Wilson," the nurse whispered, "your blood pressure is concerning. We should really get you back to the hospital." "Not yet." His mother's voice was weak but determined. "Need to hear. What happens to my boy?" Andre's hands clenched into fists. Even now, he was putting her health at risk. The weight of everything, his choices, their consequences, his mother's worsening condition, pressed down on him like a physical force. The minutes crawled by. Andre thought about everything that had led to this moment. The night drives with his father, learning to handle a car in empty parking lots. The long hours beside his mother's bed, measuring medications and monitoring symptoms, the desperate calculations, trying to make numbers work that simply wouldn't add up. He thought about Mr. Peterson's tools, about Officer Chin's testimony, about Ms. Carter's assessment, about paths not taken and choices that couldn't be unmade. The bailiff's voice cut through his thoughts. "All rise." Judge Harrison returned, carrying a single sheet of paper. The late afternoon sun had shifted again, throwing long shadows across the courtroom floor. The moment of truth had arrived. Andre stood straight, his father's voice echoing in his memory. "Face your trouble standing tall, son. Whatever came next would change everything." The only question was how. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the silent courtroom. The paper in his hands caught the late afternoon light as he adjusted his reading glasses. "Before I deliver my decision," he began, "I want to address something I've observed today." He looked directly at Andre. "Young man, you came into this courtroom expecting punishment. What I've seen instead is someone who's already been punishing himself far more than this court could." The judge set the paper down. "Mr. Wilson, the law is clear about the consequences of grand theft auto. But the law also grants this court discretion in cases where strict punishment would not serve justice or society's interests." Andre's heart hammered in his chest. Behind him, his mother's oxygen tank hissed steadily. "I've presided over hundreds of juvenile cases," Judge Harrison continued. "Most involve teenagers making impulsive decisions for selfish reasons. Your case is different. Not because your intentions were noble. The law doesn't excuse theft regardless of motivation. But because your actions reveal a larger failure of our systems," he leaned forward. "A 16-year-old should not be managing complex medical care alone. A son should not have to consider crime to save his mother's life. The fact that you felt this was your only option represents a breakdown in our social safety net." Ms. Reynolds shifted in her seat, but remained silent. However, the judge's tone hardened slightly. "None of this changes the fact that you committed a serious crime. Mr. Peterson could have lost his livelihood. Your actions had real consequences for real people." Andre nodded, his throat tight. "Therefore, this court orders the following." Judge Harrison picked up his paper. "First, you will complete 200 hours of community service at Detroit Medical Center's cancer treatment facility. You'll see firsthand how other families handle similar struggles legally." He continued, "Second, you will attend weekly counseling sessions for the next 12 months. Ms. Carter will coordinate these, focusing on stress management and decision-making skills." Andre glanced at the social worker, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Third, You will maintain your current academic standing and attend all classes. Any unauthorized absences will result in immediate review of this sentence. The judge paused, looking over his glasses. Now, to address the underlying issues. Ms. Carter has identified several programs that could assist with your mother's medical costs. This court orders you to meet with her twice monthly to explore these options and implement appropriate solutions. He turned to the prosecutor. Ms. Reynolds, your office has a victim advocacy fund, correct? Yes, Your Honor. Good. I'm ordering an assessment for possible assistance with Mrs. Wilson's medical costs through that program. While the fund typically helps crime victims, in this case, preventing future crimes by addressing root causes seems equally valuable. Ms. Reynolds nodded slowly. The office will comply, Your Honor. Additionally, Judge Harrison continued, I'm ordering the court's Social Services Department to conduct a full review of available medical assistance programs and coordinate with Mrs. Wilson's healthcare providers. He turned back to Andre. Young man, this sentence gives you an opportunity to make things right. Not just through punishment, but through positive action. However, understand this clearly. If you violate these terms or commit any new offenses, you will face juvenile detention until age 18. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honor. Andre's voice was steady despite his pounding heart. Mrs. Wilson, the judge addressed Andre's mother directly. The nurse tells me you need hospital care. Please don't delay that any longer. This court will ensure your son complies with all requirements and receives the support he needs. Andre heard his mother's whispered, "Thank you," behind him. One final thing. Judge Harrison removed his glasses. Mr. Wilson approached the bench. Andre walked forward on shaky legs. The judge lowered his voice. What you did was wrong, but why you did it, that shows character. Your father would be proud of how you've stepped up for your family. Now show him you could do it the right way. Andre blinked back tears. Yes, sir, very well. The judge's voice returned to normal volume. This court is adjourned. Mr. Wilson, report to Ms. Carter's office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to begin implementing these orders. The bailiff called all rise one final time. As people began moving, the nurse wheeled Andre's mother forward. We really need to get to the hospital now, Mrs. Wilson. Andre knelt beside the wheelchair. Mom, I'm so sorry for everything. For making you worry. For making you sicker. She reached out with a trembling hand, touching his cheek. My brave boy, always trying to carry everything alone. Her voice was weak but warm. Let these people help us now. That's what they're here for. Mrs. Wilson, the nurse interrupted gently. Your oxygen levels are dropping. We need to go. Mr. Martinez touched Andre's shoulder. They'll take good care of her. You focus on getting started with Ms. Carter tomorrow. Andre watched as they wheeled his mother toward the door, the oxygen tank trailing behind like a faithful companion. The nurse was already on her phone, coordinating with the hospital. Andre, Ms. Carter approached, notebook in hand. Let's talk about tomorrow's plan. They sat in the now empty courtroom, the late sunlight painting everything in soft gold. Ms. Carter opened her notebook to a fresh page. First step is getting you set up at the medical center for your community service. I think the pediatric oncology unit could use help with their activity programs. She looked up. How do you feel about reading to kids? Andre thought about all the nights he'd spent reading medical instructions and insurance documents. Yeah, I could do that. Good. We'll also start applications for medical assistance programs. There are several your mother might qualify for, especially given your age and caregiver status. She continued outlining plans, her pen moving steadily across the page. Andre tried to focus, but his mind kept drifting to his mother in the hospital. At least she'd get proper care now, monitoring he couldn't provide at home. Andre, Ms. Carter's voice brought him back. Are you hearing me? Sorry, just worried about Mom. She closed her notebook. Want a ride to the hospital? We can finish this planning tomorrow. Andre nodded gratefully. As they walked out of the courthouse, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Detroit spread out around them, a city of struggles and second chances. Your mom's going to be okay, Ms. Carter said as they reached her car. And so are you. One day at a time, right? One day at a time, Andre repeated. The city lights were coming on as they drove toward the hospital, each one a tiny beacon in the gathering dusk. Andre watched them blur past, thinking about choices and consequences, about punishment and mercy, about new beginnings disguised as endings. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges: community service, counseling, program applications. But for now, all that mattered was getting to his mother's side, holding her hand, and starting the long journey of making things right. The hospital rose ahead of them, its windows glowing like hundreds of small promises in the darkening sky. Andre's first day of community service started early. The pediatric oncology wing at Detroit Medical Center smelled like disinfectant and hope, its walls painted with fading cartoon characters trying too hard to be cheerful. "You'll be helping with the morning activity program," the volunteer coordinator, Mrs. Thompson, explained. She was older, with kind eyes and practical shoes that squeaked on the linoleum. Reading, board games, art projects, anything to help the kids forget where they are for a while. She led him to a small playroom where 3 children sat at a low table. Their heads were bare, skin pale under the fluorescent lights, and 4 poles stood beside each chair like a metal guardian. "This is Andre," Mrs. Thompson announced. "He's going to read with you today." A little girl, maybe 7, looked up from her coloring book. "Do you do the voices?" The last reader did all the voices. Andre swallowed hard. "I could try." He settled into the child-sized chair, picking up the worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are from the table. As he began to read, awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence, he couldn't help thinking about his mother in her own hospital room 3 floors up. "Let the wild rumpus start," he growled, making the kids giggle. Their laughter sounded like small bells ringing. After story time, Mrs. Thompson found him in the hallway. "You're good with them," she said. "Not everyone can handle this unit. It's hard seeing kids so sick." "Yeah." Andre watched through the window as a nurse adjusted one child's 4. "My mom's got cancer too. Upstairs in adult oncology." Mrs. Thompson's face softened. "That's why Judge Harrison placed you here, isn't it?" Andre nodded. 200 hours of service. "Guess he figured I should see how other families cope." "Well, we're glad to have the help. Come on, I'll show you the teen activity room. Sometimes our older patients just need someone closer to their age to talk to." The teen room was emptier. Just one boy about Andre's age playing a video game on a donated console. His face was gaunt, but his eyes were sharp as he looked up. "New volunteer?" he asked. "Something like that." Andre sat in the other chair. "I'm Andre. Marcus. Want to play?" "I'm tired of beating the computer." They played in silence for a while, the game's soft beeps and explosions filling the space between them. Finally, Marcus paused the game. "So what's your story?" he asked. "You don't seem like the usual volunteer type." Andre hesitated, then told him. About his mother's cancer, about the stolen car, about the judge's decision. Marcus listened without interrupting. "Man," he said when Andre finished, "that's rough. But at least you tried to do something. My parents just fight about the medical bills when they think I'm sleeping." After his shift ended, Andre took the elevator to his mother's floor. She was sleeping, the oxygen mask fogging gently with each breath. Her color looked better than yesterday. "She's responding well to the adjusted medication," the nurse told him, checking the monitors. The social worker was here earlier, starting paperwork for some assistance programs. Andre sat beside the bed, doing his homework while his mother slept. The room's window faced east, catching the afternoon sun. Sometimes between math problems, he found himself watching the light move across the floor, thinking about the kids downstairs in their cheerful prison of a playroom. His phone buzzed, a text from Ms. Carter reminding him about tomorrow's counseling appointment. He'd almost forgotten. The counselor's office was in a strip mall, wedged between a discount furniture store and a cell phone repair shop. Dr. Patel was younger than Andre expected, with a neat beard and running shoes poking out under his slacks. "Tell me about your first day at the hospital," Dr. Patel said after they'd handled the introductions. "It was different." Andre searched for words. "These kids, they're so sick, but they still laugh at stupid jokes and fight over who gets the red crayon. And their parents, they look exactly like my mom. Same tired eyes, same worried faces when they think nobody's watching." "What does that bring up for you?" Andre stared at his hands. "Makes me feel stupid for thinking stealing a car would fix anything. All these families are dealing with the same thing, but they're doing it right. Finding programs, working with social workers, just keeping going. Dr. Patel leaned forward. They're also not doing it alone. That's what I want to focus on today. Building your support system. You've been carrying this weight by yourself for a long time. They spent the session mapping out people and resources Andre could lean on. Ms. Carter for program navigation. The hospital social worker for medical coordination. Dr. Patel himself for stress management. Even Marcus in the teen room, who understood the unique weight of watching a family crack under medical strain. Support isn't weakness, Dr. Patel said as their time ended. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you can't do it all alone. The next few days fell into a rhythm. Mornings at the hospital, reading stories, and playing games with kids who understood too much about pain. Afternoons with his mother, watching her grow stronger as the new treatment plan took hold. Evening counseling sessions or meetings with Ms. Carter, navigating the maze of assistance programs and insurance appeals. 1 week into his community service, Andre arrived at the pediatric unit to find the playroom empty. Sarah's having a rough day, Mrs. Thompson explained, meaning the little girl who loves story voices. Chemo's hitting hard. She asked for you, though. Said maybe a story would help. Andre found Sarah in her room, curled around a pink bucket. Her mother sat beside her, stroking her back. Hey, Sarah. Andre kept his voice soft. Want to hear what Max and the Wild Things are up to today? She nodded weakly. Andre pulled up a chair and began to read, doing all the voices, even the roars. By the third page, Sarah had stopped clutching the bucket so tightly. You're good at this, her mother said as Andre was leaving. Thank you. Just paying back a debt, he replied. That evening, he told his mother about Sarah during his visit. She was sitting up in bed now, the oxygen mask replaced by a nasal cannula. Sounds like you're making a difference, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Maybe. Andre adjusted her blanket. The coordinator said they might keep me on as a regular volunteer after my hours are done. If I want. His mother smiled. Do you want to? Andre thought about Sarah's face lighting up at the Wild Thing voices. About Marcus finally beating the game's boss level. About parents who looked at him with grateful tears when he made their children laugh. Yeah, he said. I think I do. Later, in Dr. Patel's office, they talked about this new direction. It's like, I went there thinking it was punishment, Andre tried to explain. But these kids, they're fighting so hard. And their families too. Makes me want to help somehow. That's called personal growth, Dr. Patel said. Taking a negative experience and finding meaning in it. Using it to help others. Andre thought about the judge's words. Showing character through how you handle consequences. On his way home, he stopped by the teen room one last time. Marcus was there, teaching another patient how to play the game. Hey, story guy, he called out. Want to join? I'm starting a tournament for anyone strong enough to hold a controller. Andre looked at his watch. He had an hour before his next meeting with Ms. Carter. Yeah, he said, pulling up a chair. I've got time. The game's theme music filled the room as more teens drifted in, drawn by the promise of normal competition in their abnormal world. Andre watched them trash talk and laugh, their four poles forgotten in the excitement. Sometimes he realized healing happened in unexpected places. Sometimes punishment turned into purpose. Sometimes mistakes led to missions. Through the window, Detroit's lights were coming on again, each one a reminder that darkness wasn't permanent. That tomorrow brought new chances, new stories, new ways to make things right. 3 months after the court hearing, Andre stood in the hospital auditorium, watching as Mrs. Thompson pinned a volunteer service badge to his shirt. The small ceremony marked his completion of the required 200 hours, though he'd already signed up to continue volunteering. Andre has become an essential part of our pediatric oncology team, Mrs. Thompson announced to the small gathering. His dedication to our young patients goes far beyond court-mandated service. In the front row, his mother sat without her oxygen tank for the first time in months. The new treatment had worked better than anyone expected. Her face had color again, and she could walk short distances without getting winded. Mr. Peterson, the man whose car Andre had stolen, sat a few seats away. He'd started coming to the hospital every other weekend, using his mechanical skills to fix broken wheelchairs and medical equipment. His forgiveness had come gradually, through shared work and understanding. "I'd like to say something," Andre said when Mrs. Thompson finished. He hadn't planned to speak, but the words came anyway. "3 months ago, I thought this was punishment. Standing here now, I realize it was really a rescue." He looked at his mother, then at the faces of people who'd become more than just supervisors or counselors. "Sometimes you have to hit bottom to see who's reaching down to help you up. I'm grateful for everyone who reached down for me and my family." After the ceremony, Ms. Carter caught up with him in the hallway. "Got a minute? Need to review your progress report for the judge." They found an empty consultation room. Ms. Carter opened her notebook, the same one she'd carried since that first day in court. Community service completed ahead of schedule. Counseling attendance perfect. Grades up to A- average. She looked up. "The judge will be pleased. But I'm more interested in how you're feeling about everything." Andre considered the question. "Honestly, I feel lighter. Like I'm not carrying everything alone anymore. That's what we were aiming for." She made a note. "How's your mom doing with the new treatment plan?" "Better every day. The assistance program you found covers most of the costs. And having the home health aide 3 days a week means she's never alone while I'm at school." "And you're still interested in pre-med for college?" Andre nodded. "Already started the applications. Dr. Martinez wrote me a recommendation letter. Said watching me with the pediatric patients showed him I had what it takes." They were interrupted by a knock. Sarah, the little girl who loved story voices, poked her head in. She was having a good day. You could tell by the sparkle in her eyes. "Andre, you promised to read the new chapter before my treatment." 2 minutes, he told her, then turned back to Ms. Carter. "Speaking of patients," Ms. Carter smiled. "Go. We can finish this later." In the teen activity room, Marcus was teaching another patient how to play chess. His treatment was working. His face had filled out, and he had wisps of new hair showing. "Tournament next week," he called out as Andre passed. "You're still organizing it, right?" "Already got the brackets set up," Andre confirmed. He found Sarah in her usual spot, the new book clutched in her small hands. Her mother mouthed a thank you as he sat down. "Where did we leave off?" he asked, though he knew exactly where they'd stopped yesterday. "The part where everything changes," Sarah said, "where it starts getting better." Andre opened the book, thinking how those words could describe so many stories, including his own. Later that evening, he sat with his mother in her hospital room, sharing the dinner he'd brought from home. She'd started cooking again, small meals that filled their apartment with familiar smells of better days. "I saw Marcus's mom today," she said between bites. "She told me what you did for them last week." Andre looked down at his plate. He'd helped Marcus's parents apply for the same assistance program that had saved them, walking them through paperwork he now knew by heart. "Just passing on what I learned," he said. "You're doing more than that, baby." His mother reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "You're turning your pain into purpose. Your father would be so proud." Andre thought about his father's lessons about facing consequences, about standing tall in troubled times, about making things right when you've done wrong. "I miss him," Andre said quietly. "Wish he could see how he made it through." "He sees." His mother's eyes were bright with tears and pride. "Every time you help those kids smile through their pain. Every time you show another family they're not alone." "He sees." A nurse came in to start his mother's evening medication routine. A schedule Andre had once managed alone, now shared among a team of professionals and support workers. "Don't forget your counseling session tomorrow," his mother reminded him as he gathered his things to leave. "Never do." The sessions with Dr. Patel had become less about crisis management and more about future planning. They'd started talking about scholarship applications, about summer internships at the hospital, about turning his experience into opportunities to help others. Walking through the pediatric ward on his way out, Andre stopped to look in on Sarah. She was sleeping. The book they'd been reading still clutched in her arms. Her mother had fallen asleep too, in the chair beside the bed. He adjusted their blankets quietly, remembering all the nights he'd done the same for his own mother. But now they weren't alone in their struggles. Now they had help, had hope, had a way forward that didn't require desperate choices in dark moments. The night shift nurses waved as he left. He'd become a familiar face here, part of the extended family that formed in hospital corridors and waiting rooms, united by shared battles against illness and despair. Outside, Detroit's lights painted the sky in familiar patterns. The same streets that had once led him toward a terrible choice now carried him home with purpose. Tomorrow would bring more stories to read, more families to help, more ways to prove that rock bottom could become a foundation for something better. His phone buzzed, a text from Ms. Carter reminding him about next week's final court review. But he wasn't worried anymore. The judge would see what everyone else had seen, that consequences could become opportunities, that punishment could lead to purpose, that a single bad choice didn't have to define a life. Andre looked up at the hospital windows, each one containing its own story of struggle and hope. Somewhere up there, his mother was getting stronger. Down in pediatrics, Sarah was dreaming of wild things and happy endings. In the teen room, Marcus was planning next week's tournament. And here, on the ground, Andre Wilson was walking forward into a future he never could have imagined 3 months ago. A future built not on desperate acts or lonely battles, but on the simple, powerful truth he'd finally learned. Sometimes the real saving happens when you stop trying to save everyone alone. The city hummed around him as he walked home, its rhythm steady as a heartbeat, constant as hope, strong as second chances.